The petrodollar is dying, not weakening, not facing challenges that a skilled Federal Reserve chairman and a competent Treasury secretary can manage through the next election cycle and hand off to their successors as someone else's problem. Dying. And the reason nobody in mainstream financial media is saying that word with the clarity and the urgency that the data demands is the same reason the crew of a sinking ship does not announce the situation over the intercom until the captain has personally confirmed that the lifeboats are insufficient, and the outcome is no longer in doubt. The outcome is no longer in doubt. Saudi Arabia, the nation whose 1974 agreement with Henry Kissinger created the petrodollar system, and whose continued participation in that system is the single non-negotiable precondition of its survival, just completed its 15th yuan-denominated oil transaction. 15. Not an experiment, not a diplomatic gesture, not a one-time hedge against dollar volatility. A pattern. A deliberate, accelerating, strategically calculated pattern of moving the world's most important commodity out of the dollar system, one transaction at a time, with the patience and the precision of a nation that has spent 50 years inside a financial arrangement. It did not design, did not choose, and has been quietly building the exit from when Saudi Arabia, the founding pillar, the indispensable partner, the nation whose participation makes the petrodollar system what it is, starts moving its oil transactions out of the dollar. The system is not facing a challenge, it is facing its end. And nobody, not the investors holding dollar-denominated assets, not the pension funds priced for a world of dollar stability, not the governments whose debt is denominated in a currency, whose reserve status is the only thing keeping their borrowing costs manageable, nobody is ready for what comes next. This is that preparation. Let us build the precise picture of what is actually happening, because the aggregated data tells a story that no single headline captures with sufficient force. The petrodollar system, as constructed by Kissinger and Saudi Arabia's King Faisal in 1974, rested on three interlocking commitments. Saudi Arabia would price its oil exclusively in dollars. Saudi oil revenues, the petrodollars, would be recycled into American Treasury bonds and American military equipment purchases. And America would guarantee the security of the Saudi monarchy against internal and external threats with the full weight of American military power. The arrangement was never formalized in a public treaty. It was never ratified by any legislature. It was a secret understanding between two governments that became the hidden engine of American financial dominance for 5 decades. It worked because it created a self-reinforcing cycle of dollar demand that no other currency could replicate. Every nation that imported oil needed dollars to pay for it. To get dollars, they had to export goods to America or borrow in dollar-denominated debt markets. The dollars they accumulated went into treasury purchases that funded American deficit spending. American deficit spending funded the military that protected the Gulf. The Gulf protection guaranteed the oil pricing arrangement that required everyone to hold dollars. The cycle was elegant, it was self-sustaining, and for 50 years it appeared permanent. It was not permanent, it was contingent. Contingent on Saudi Arabia's continued willingness to price its most valuable asset in a currency it does not control, issued by a nation whose strategic interests are not always aligned with Riyadh's, under a security guarantee whose credibility has been visibly declining. The specific events that have eroded Saudi confidence in the American security guarantee are documented and sequential. The American withdrawal from Afghanistan in August 2021, executed without adequate coordination with regional partners, producing a chaotic collapse that every Gulf state watched with alarm as a demonstration of American commitment reliability. The Biden administration's initial decision to freeze arms sales to Saudi Arabia and remove Houthi forces from the terror designation list, a decision that directly reduced Saudi security while Houthi missiles were striking Saudi oil infrastructure. The Abraham Accords, a genuine American diplomatic achievement, simultaneously revealing the limits of American ability to deliver the broader regional security architecture that Saudi Arabia needs to feel genuinely protected. Each of these events, individually, was manageable. Together they communicated to Riyadh that the American security guarantee, the price Saudi Arabia paid for pricing its oil in dollars, was worth less than it had been in 1974 when Kissinger wrote the original agreement. And simultaneously, China was offering something different, not a military guarantee. China does not yet have the power projection capability to replace American security provision in the Gulf, but something in some ways more valuable, unconditional economic engagement without the human rights conditions, the democratic governance requirements, and the alignment demands that American partnership increasingly entailed. China is Saudi Arabia's largest oil customer. It purchases 1.76 million barrels of Saudi crude per day, more than any other nation. The economic relationship is deeper, more dependent, and more structurally important than the American security relationship in ways that Riyadh's young leadership, oriented toward Vision 2030 and economic modernization rather than Cold War alliance politics, finds increasingly relevant to its strategic calculus. The yuan oil transactions are not Saudi Arabia abandoning the dollar system. They are Saudi Arabia diversifying away from exclusive dollar dependence, building the infrastructure of an alternative arrangement so that when the American security guarantee deteriorates, Further, or when the dollar's reserve status erodes to the point where pricing oil in dollars becomes economically costly rather than merely politically inconvenient, Riyadh has the operational capability to complete the transition without disruption. This is strategic patience at civilizational scale, and the financial markets have not priced it. Now add the infrastructure that supports the Saudi move. The Chinese Cross-Border Interbank Payment System, CIPS, processed $14 trillion in transactions in the last fiscal year outside the SWIFT network. The BRICS payment settlement system now covers 40% of global trade. Digital yuan pilot programs are operational in 27 nations across 3 continents. Russian energy exports, 8 million barrels per day of oil equivalent, are now priced and settled predominantly in yuan, rubles, and rupees. Iranian oil flowing at approximately 1.5 million barrels per day through Chinese and other alternative channels has not touched the dollar system in 3 years. The alternative infrastructure is not being built. It has been built. The transition from dollar system to multipolar monetary system is not a future risk that policymakers have time to manage. It is a present reality that markets have not yet priced. And this is the hidden vulnerability, the strategic blind spot, that makes the coming repricing so potentially violent. Financial markets price risks that are visible, acknowledged, and consensually accepted as relevant. They systematically underprice risks that are structural, gradual, and ideologically inconvenient to acknowledge. Risks whose acknowledgement would require revising assumptions so fundamental to current valuations that the revision itself would trigger the crisis. The dollar's reserve status is that risk. The petrodollar system's survival is that assumption. And the 15 Saudi yuan oil transactions are the data points that are making the risk visible at exactly the moment when the alternative infrastructure has reached sufficient scale to make the transition self-sustaining. To understand why the petrodollar's breakdown is not a policy failure that can be reversed but a historical inevitability that is playing out according to a pattern as old as monetary systems themselves, you need to understand what happened in Amsterdam between 1650 and 1720. The Dutch guilder was the world's reserve currency in the 17th century. Amsterdam was the center of global finance. The Dutch East India Company, the VOC, was the most valuable corporation in the history of capitalism, with a peak valuation equivalent to $8 trillion in today's money. Dutch financial innovation, the joint stock company, the stock exchange, the central bank, the bond market, had created the most sophisticated financial system the world had ever seen, and the guilder's reserve status rested on the same foundation that every reserve currency status has always rested on: the credibility of the power behind it to protect the trade routes and enforce the contracts that make the currency's dominance functional. The Dutch lost that credibility, not through a single military defeat but through a process of gradual overextension. 4 Anglo-Dutch wars in 50 years, the War of Spanish Succession, the maintenance of an overseas empire that required constant military expenditure that the Dutch financial system, for all its sophistication, could not sustain indefinitely. By 1720, the guilder's reserve status was functionally over, superseded by the pound sterling, backed by Britain's superior naval power and the productive capacity of its emerging industrial revolution. The transition was not announced, it was not managed. It emerged from the accumulated weight of Dutch financial overextension meeting British financial innovation at a historical inflection point. Read that pattern against the current situation with the precision it deserves. The dollar's reserve status rests on American military power, protecting global trade routes and enforcing the contracts that make dollar-denominated global commerce functional. That military power is being deployed across 3 simultaneous strategic theaters: Europe, the Middle East, the Indo-Pacific, against adversaries who each only need to dominate their own neighborhood to challenge American global reach. The financial cost of that deployment, $886 billion in annual defense spending added to $1.1 trillion in annual interest payments on $35 trillion in debt, is consuming an increasing share of American fiscal capacity at exactly the moment that the productive base needed to fund it is declining relative to its primary challenger. This is Dutch overextension in the 17th century. This is British overextension in the 20th century. This is the pattern that every reserve currency issuer has followed in the terminal phase of its dominance, not because the pattern is predetermined, but because the incentive structure of reserve currency privilege consistently produces the same behavioral sequence. Reserve currency privilege allows unlimited borrowing at artificially low rates. Unlimited borrowing funds military overextension. Military overextension requires financial resources that exceed productive capacity. Productive capacity decline requires more borrowing to maintain military reach. More borrowing accelerates the credibility erosion that undermines reserve currency status. The cycle is self-reinforcing in its decline as surely as it was self-reinforcing in its ascent. And the petrodollar system is the specific mechanism through which American reserve currency privilege has been maintained in the 50 years since the gold standard ended. Its breakdown is not the cause of American imperial decline. It is the symptom, the moment when the accumulated weight of the structural forces driving that decline becomes visible in the financial system that has been most effectively insulated from their consequences. The specific historical parallel that best captures the current moment is not the Dutch transition of the early 18th century, but the sterling transition of the mid-20th. Because the sterling transition happened under conditions of American challenge that most closely resemble the conditions of Chinese challenge that America faces today. Britain maintained sterling's reserve status through the 1920s and 1930s, through a combination of institutional inertia, the absence of a fully developed alternative, and the willingness to impose significant economic pain on the British population to maintain the gold peg that underpinned sterling credibility. The pain was real: unemployment, deflation, industrial contraction, and it produced the political instability of the interwar period that contributed to the conditions that made the Second World War possible. The war itself finished what the economic mismanagement of the interwar period had begun. By 1945, Britain held $3.4 billion in gold and dollar reserves against $14 billion in sterling liabilities, a reserve ratio of 24% that was unsustainable against any significant speculative attack on the pound. Bretton Woods formalized what the economic reality had already determined. The dollar replaced sterling as the world's reserve currency, not because American policymakers outmaneuvered British ones, but because the productive capacity, the financial reserves, and the military reach of the two nations had inverted completely over the preceding 40 years. Now the productive capacity, the financial reserves, and arguably the military reach of America and China have been inverting for the preceding 40 years. China's GDP in purchasing power parity terms exceeded America's in 2017. Its manufacturing output is double America's. Its foreign exchange reserves stand at $3.2 trillion against America's $244 billion. Its Belt and Road infrastructure investment has created economic dependencies across 150 nations that make yuan-denominated trade more natural than dollar-denominated trade for an increasing share of global commerce. The petrodollar is not breaking because China is destroying it. It is breaking because the productive and financial foundations that made American reserve currency dominance credible are eroding, and because China has built sufficient alternative infrastructure that the nations which have been most poorly served by the dollar system now have a viable exit. Saudi Arabia is not the first to use that exit. It is the most important. So what does the next phase look like, and what does it mean for ordinary people trying to preserve their wealth through the transition? In the immediate term, the critical indicator to watch is the pace of central bank gold accumulation. Central banks have purchased over 3,000 tons of gold in the last 24 months, the highest sustained pace in 60 years. They are not doing this because gold pays a dividend or generates cash flow. They are doing it because they are replacing dollar reserves with an asset that carries no counterparty risk, no political strings, and no expiration date. When the institutions that collectively manage the global monetary system are replacing dollars with gold at the fastest pace in 60 years, they are not making a speculative bet. They are making a strategic judgment about the durability of the system their dollar reserves depend on. That judgment is the most important signal in the current financial environment. More important than any Federal Reserve statement. More important than any Treasury auction result. More important than any earnings report or economic data release. The people who manage the world's money are voting with their reserves, and they are voting against the dollar. In the medium term, 12 to 36 months, the specific trigger that accelerates the petrodollar transition from gradual to rapid is a formal Saudi announcement of yuan pricing for a significant portion of its oil exports. This announcement has not been made. It may not be made in explicit terms. But the operational infrastructure, the yuan swap lines, the Shanghai crude futures contracts, the bilateral payment arrangements with China, is already in place. When the announcement comes, or when the yuan transaction volume crosses the threshold where the market begins pricing the announcement as inevitable, the repricing of dollar assets will be sudden, significant, and disproportionate to the specific transaction volumes involved. Reserve currency transitions do not price gradually. They price in steps, long periods of apparent stability, punctuated by sudden revaluations, as the market revises its probability distribution for the transition scenario. In the long term, the world that emerges from the petrodollar transition will be financially more complex, more expensive to navigate, and less stable than the world organized around a single dominant reserve currency. Not worse in every dimension, the dollar system imposed costs on the developing world that the multipolar alternative is unlikely to replicate at the same scale, but more volatile, more susceptible to regional financial crises, more demanding of the financial literacy and the asset diversification that most ordinary people in dollar economy nations have never needed because the dollar system's stability made them unnecessary. The transition from the guilder to sterling took approximately 70 years from the point of Dutch overextension to the point of British dominance. The transition from sterling to the dollar took approximately 40 years. Transitions accelerate as the financial infrastructure for alternatives develops faster with each iteration of the cycle. The transition from the dollar to whatever comes next, whether a yuan-dominated system, a multipolar basket arrangement, a commodity-backed digital currency, or something not yet designed, will likely take less time than the sterling transition. The alternative infrastructure is already more developed than the dollar infrastructure was at the equivalent point in the sterling transition. That means the window for preparation is shorter than historical precedent suggests. The petrodollar is not going to collapse overnight. The dollar will not lose its reserve status in a single dramatic event. The transition will be gradual until the moment it is not. Until the moment when the accumulated weight of Saudi yuan transactions, central bank gold purchases, CIPS payment volumes, and BRICS trade settlement reaches the threshold where the market's probability distribution for dollar dominance revision crosses from unlikely to inevitable. At that moment, every asset priced on the assumption of continued dollar reserve status will reprice simultaneously. Every pension fund, every government bond market, every mortgage, every savings account, denominated in a currency whose value has been artificially supported by the petrodollar system's demand for dollar-denominated assets. The people who understood the transition before that moment will have positioned themselves accordingly. The people who trusted the official assurances that the dollar system is permanent, that reserve currency status is self-sustaining, that the 15 Saudi yuan transactions are an anomaly rather than a pattern, those people will discover at significant personal financial cost that the official assurances were the last service the system provided to the people most dependent on it. Empires do not protect your wealth when they are defending their own survival. The petrodollar empire is defending its survival right now. And 15 oil transactions, denominated in yuan, are the evidence that the defense is failing. Subscribe, share this. Because the transition from the petrodollar world to whatever comes next is the single most consequential financial event of the next decade, and the window to understand it, before it understands you, is closing faster than the consensus will admit. The system that governed the world for 50 years is breaking. Nobody is ready. You can be.